Signore e signori, buonasera. Buonasera. Benvenuti alla Casa Italiana Zerilli-Marimò della New York University. We are delighted to have you here tonight for this very special trip that we are taking into the Piazza of Italy, the most iconic and symbolic place that represents also in some way a form of Italian identity. But I'm not going to steal the job of Craig Whitaker, who is here with us tonight. I was very happy when we first met and we started talking, and I could hear the passion that he has for the topic of this research and more in general for architecture and especially for the architecture of public spaces. He devoted his life to that. We can say he's a man on the waterfront because most of his research and his work concentrated on a project related to the requalification of the waterfront. But Piazza of Italy, the squares of Italy, are not on the waterfront, and they occupy an important place in his art. Craig Whitaker was also for about 18 years a professor here at New York University, and he taught in the graduate planning program. He taught a course entitled Why Cities Look the Way They Look, and I think I would have loved to take his course. He's the author of numerous articles and of the book Architecture and the American Dream. But tonight he's here to talk about the Italian reality. Thank you.
This is Camillo Sitte, an Austrian with an Italian name, who in 1889 wrote a book called City Planning According to Artistic Principles. He wrote the book because he had learned that Franz Joseph, who was the emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, had filled up the spaces within the Ringstrasse in Vienna and needing new buildings, important for a bureaucracy, had wanted to leap over the Ringstrasse and start building outside it. Sitte wanted him to think about the Piazza as a way to undertake the effort. He was so successful that Sitte's Schools, is the German, Sitte's Schools, sprung up all over Europe with students studying piazzas. He was famous enough that he actually got a stamp. I can't remember, 2 pfennigs, I guess it is. At any rate, his schools prospered, and then came the First World War. The Austro-Hungarian Empire disappeared. It was broken up into pieces. Italy actually got Trieste as one of the bennies of having been at the war. But at any rate, what happened next is even more important, and that is that a young architect named Charles-Édouard Jeanneret, who took the moniker Le Corbusier, arrived in Paris and started saying, he rented an airplane, in fact, and dropped leaflets all over the city, saying that the new city was a city of towers that were enabled because of the invention of the elevator and structural steel. At any rate, he got even more pronounced with it. He produced something called the Ville Radieuse, which was towers set in this wonderful green sward, laced with freeways and speeding automobiles at grade, and all the towers looming above. You can see his work here in New York on many public housing projects. You can certainly walk over to First Avenue and look at Stuyvesant Town and Peter Cooper Village, which are excellent examples of what architects call the tower in the park. Well, Sitte was a dead goose at that point. The schools evaporated very quickly. Now, not only was it Corbusier, but after the First World War, we fell in love with France. Folies Bergère, Edith Piaf, Corbusier, French onion soup. It all seemed to fit together. But fickle lovers that the Americans can be, after the Second World War, we really fell in love with Italy. Clark Gable showed up in Portofino. John Steinbeck wrote about Positano. We learned that although Sophia Loren was wonderful, Anna Magnani was a volcanic earth mother, as people called. We also learned that there was much more to Italian cuisine than spaghetti and meatballs. But perhaps the most important thing that we learned was that Italy, in many ways, doesn't think of itself as Italy, still to this day. It was, until 1860, a peninsula of various fiefdoms, states. There was the Republic of Venice, there was the Kingdom of Naples, the Duchy of Toscano, of Tuscany, and these were all fighting with each other. It wasn't until 1860 when the city, or the country of Italy was actually put together. One of the things that we also fell in love with all over again was the Piazza. These are sketches from Sita's book, and these are drawings that he made of him by himself. He sort of gives himself away at the very beginning of the book because you can see these churches are for the most part rather simple diagrams, meaning that they were probably inserted into a blank spot where there was room to put a piazza. But he lamented the past of what he called naturalistic piazzas, and recognized that if he were going to convince Franz Joseph, or where he had been able to do so, the piazzas would have been done with T-square and triangle. They would have had to accommodate traffic. That's an interesting point in itself, because this was 15 years before the automobile and the truck became seen every day on the streets around the world. He laid out a number of rules, one of which was that you shouldn't put statues in the middle of a piazza. Simple things. This is the piazza in Padua, and you can see that it is joined. I have never understood what this room outside the church would look like. Is it the inverse of the church? I have no idea. But the statue is Gatta Malata, excuse me. And he was a mercenary, and he got his statue, and Sita was pleased because it was put exactly where it should have been and wasn't dominating the piazza. He was very interested in the fact that most of the churches in most of the piazzas in Rome were in fact attached. The interesting one to me are the two that had all four sides attached. My first reaction was that you had to go to the kitchen in the trattoria and pass through a door. But of course, this wasn't the case. Really, many of these churches were in private homes because during the Roman Empire, the Romans were out looking for Christians. And so having a service in a discreet place like this was something people did on a regular basis. He said that there were 6 that were freestanding, and also added the note that one was Anglican and the other Protestant. I thought they were nearly the same thing, but he didn't. He showed the, it's called the Signoria in Florence. And you can see here that he is saluting the fact that the statue, the fountain of Neptune, is actually right near the church and not in the center, although he didn't say anything about D. If you look at D up there, that's actually a statue of Cosimo de' Medici. And Cosimo could put a statue anywhere he wanted in this piazza. He, at that point, owned the town. At any rate, even there, the statue looks like it might be a border between the 2 parts of the piazza. The road leading in leads right to the statue. At any rate, the reason I'm showing you this is there's no church. Now, Sita didn't take much time to think about the issue, but there were many cities, particularly the bigger ones, which had a bigger economy, where they could resist having the church as part of the solution. Siena is a good example. Milano is another example. Most of the smaller cities did enjoin a space which in Florence is called the Signoria. It means it's a part of the piazza which is given over to the commercial folk, the parts of the town that aren't related directly to the church. This is one of my favorites because once you had decided upon a church, once the negotiations had been held, the next step was where to put the church. Now, this is Modena, which actually has a church which looks far more grand than this. But I would say, looking at this, that the church got stiffed. It looks as if somebody had misbehaved, and the church has been told to go stand in a corner for a couple of centuries. This happened often. There were arguments about where the churches would go. At any rate, from there, we can look at a couple of other examples. This is the Piazza in Todi, in Perugia. And it shows us a number of different things. It shows us the church, which is at the head of the square. And if you look down to the right, near the corner, you'll see a second stairway. Well, clearly that stair is less wide than the stair to the church. It's absolutely obvious that the church has the wide stair, and the government, the town, the mayor, the city government has the smaller stair, perfectly in order. The church itself, you can see, as many Christian churches is actually a building which has a very high center aisle and lower side aisles. In this particular instance, what they've done is actually build the church bigger. Now, this isn't like the bar in Texas where it says bar and you go in and it's only a single-story little teeny building serving drinks. They did this for a very good reason, which is it helped to close the piazza. One of the things that Citta wanted very much was that all piazzas be closed. I think there's something here that hasn't been studied, which is that the trip to the piazza is an important part of the adventure. You seek your faith and you find it when you get there. You start through a series of vicoli, alleys to get there. It's dark and you arrive at the church. At any rate, this isn't exactly as it looks like. If you look to the left side, you'll see a yard, open yard. That was actually where all the church activities were held. When I got there and I had gone to take some pictures, I couldn't because the main piazza was filled with a skateboard and video game festival. So I spent an hour learning about skateboards. I'll call them back. At any rate, I'll show you another shot. There's the church with the big stair and the city with the smaller stair. And here they are. You don't need any signs. It's absolutely clear. The church is the bigger of the two. The one that is more important. You see the stair up to the city hall, and you also see the loggia underneath it. Many of these had a loggia. Its only function was to keep things dry when it rained, and including the people who were there. I'm going to show you one more slide, which is a plan of Todi. The Italians, based originally on something called a Noli map that was produced in the 18th century, often draw buildings and only show the roof except for the important buildings. So here you see the church. It almost bumps into the corner of the building there. It's off just a little bit. It makes it look better. It makes it seem real. It's like the Navajos who would deliberately put a mistake into a rug they were weaving on the belief that they couldn't be perfect. But you see the stair down. Why I'm showing you this is that whether this was done consciously over a period of time or with a plan over time, is that the two green areas are actually where the piazza opens out to the land beyond. And it is set in such a way that you get the morning sun at I guess we'd call it the Piazzetta. That's a statue of Garibaldi who hung out in Todi after his first attempt at putting together the Italian Republic failed. But you get the afternoon sun here. So I've seen pictures of Todi with the actual sunlight coming in. This is San Gimignano, and I must say it is one of the few piazzas with which I have little affection. You can see, if you look to the lower right of the screen, an alley which is leading into this triangular piazza. It's called La Piazza della Cisterna, the cistern piazza. It's where they get the water. Many of these piazzas had a very single function, which was to supply water. And then you have to pass through a very narrow little gap. I'm going to walk over and just tell you, right here. And it opens out. This is the steps of the church. And I thought when I was there, I wasn't thinking about piazzas. Oh, this is really kind of weird. It's like a failed marriage. The couple can't part completely because they're raising the kids or they've got financial investments. But it seemed kind of unfortunate. It didn't make me feel good. San Gimignano at one point had some 72 towers. That was another issue, certainly for me. I know that Bologna also had them, but I've always felt that the towers were a little bit like the tulip craze in Holland or the hula hoop in the United States. Several of these towers were, you can see them here, several of these towers were 90 meters, which meant there was about 300 steps. Many of the towers supposedly had the kitchen on the top floor. Now, I can't imagine climbing 300 steps twice a day. When I'm on the F train, which stops at West 4th Street, there's 73 steps to the, I usually get out at 14th Street. At any rate, the 72 towers were for a population of about 7,000. Now, when you do the math, that meant that nearly 1 in every 100 persons would be associated through family with a tower. At any rate, there were 14 left, and the towers really didn't interest me, and off I went. But before I left, I went to the church plaza, and if you look closely to the left of the church, which, by the way, has that high in the middle, lower on both sides profile, you see a bridge, closed bridge, that leads from the tallest tower. Now, what was that about? I mean, was Mr. Big able to get to the second floor of the church without being seen? This is sort of like the Medicis and the Ponte Vecchio. More to the point here is if you look closely, it doesn't have a front door. It has 2 side doors. I was really anxious to get going. I did not spend much time there. Here's onto the Renaissance. Here's the Campidoglio in Rome. It is a wonderful project. The paving, the paving pattern was put in only 400 years after the Campidoglio was finished. It was something that Mussolini did. But the most important part of this piazza is the fact that the 2 side buildings on either side, and I'm backing up a bit, I'm going to show you those in just a moment. The 2 side buildings were at an angle with the church, and the City Hall. Off to the left, and I don't like to back up, but I am going to back up because I forgot to tell you something, which is that next to the Campidoglio is the Church of Santa Maria Aracoeli. I hadn't found what that's meant. I've spent a fair amount of time looking. At any rate, the church is right next door, so that when Michelangelo took the job, he had to accommodate the church. Now, many scholars who've looked at this said that the reason that he put both buildings at a slight angle with the City Hall was because of the nearness of the Santa Maria Aracoeli. I said it correctly. And you can see here what a magnificent job this was. The musculature of Michelangelo's work And he has rearranged his relationship with the Santa Maria by putting a wide stair up near the church. But think of it for a moment. This reach of your arms, it's almost an invitation to come. It is the person in the piazza reaching out and saying he wants the town government to come to him, figuratively and literally. The granite and the marble doesn't move, but your eyes tell you that it is coming closer. It is intention. It is a wonderful piece of business. Now, I think that Michelangelo clearly was trying to, I'm using Michael now instead of Michael, that the reason for this was that it would offer him an opportunity to do something that is starting to make art out of the piazza itself. He spent a lot of time, he supposedly found the statue of Marcus Aurelius in the basement and wanted to put it at the center of the piazza. But he arranged things so that as you came up the ramp, the head of Marcus would appear first, and he would be directly on line with the front door of the city hall, which is behind. He had to put move the city hall front door so that that would be the case. But he did much more than that in this piazza. This is one of the museums. In fact, the two buildings comprise apparently the first museum in the world. But you see here that the pilasters, there are 7 of them, are the same pilasters that were on City Hall, but he added columns on the ground floor. Now, a column is more expensive to build than the pilasters. So in a very interesting way, for the first time, he made the 2 lower buildings as important or slightly more important than the City Hall itself. Before we leave, I want to show you this last little picture. There is a sort of a collision at the bottom of the Cordonata. You will see that they have borrowed a piece of the stairway from the church. Now, to give this an American analogy, imagine that you live in the suburbs and have for some time, and a neighbor moves in who comes to you and says he's bought a second car, but he didn't have a big enough driveway, so he's going to take part of your front lawn. I would have loved, I'm sure that Michelangelo was long gone, but I would have loved to have seen the negotiation. Maybe they just went and knocked on the door of the church and said, we're going to take this piece of business because we need it. The Campidoglio is more important than the church. Piranesi. Piranesi, an 18th century artist who was famous for his prisons and for these wild drawings. He had a great ability to project perspective, and his drawings are still up for sale in the art market, and you can find replicas on the dormitory wall, bedroom wall of most colleges across the United States. He was a very popular figure. At any rate, among his duties, he did a drawing of the Campidoglio, and he blew it. First of all, he's got a very happy landing between the Cordonata and the stair from Santa Maria, but he sets the buildings in an orthogonal relationship. Now, is it he didn't get it? Is it he didn't like it? Maybe he never knew that it had happened. And if that is the case, Michelangelo would be quite pleased because he could do the magic without sharing the trick. There they are. You can see he's got a much wider ramp. The ramp was ostensibly so horse and carriage could drive right up to the front door of City Hall, bringing the swells who had business with the city. To give you a proof that this was something that every artist kind of understood, on the left is a plan and section of what's called the prospettiva, which was done by Borromini, and this exists at the Palazzo Spada, which is next door to the Palazzo Farnese that Michelangelo did. For many years, you could walk in for free and enjoy the spectacle. Now they've decided they need to monetize it, and I can't remember what it is, but I think it's 10 euros a pop to go in and see this. But essentially, what Borromini did was set up this kind of false perspective. You see the person at the left end, it's the same person who will walk to the back end. But what he did was quite remarkable. He lifted the pathway, he shortened the pattern, he brought the columns closer together, and it was really quite a difficult thing to do. He took the vaulted ceiling and lowered it and nailed it. And so you will find people all over the world who take two pictures, one of you standing at the front end and one of you standing at the back end. If you focus at the box that's at the end, he put that in so that if you wouldn't see the windows or something that would give you a sense of the real scale, and he lit it, or he put the walls up so that you would get sunlight back, bouncing in there. At any rate, people take two picters, one of you at the front end and one of you at the back end. And of course, you're much bigger at the back end. Even better was Bernini. This is the Scala Regia in Rome, which is part of the Vatican. And here again, he takes the columns, and you see that they become closer together, or in this case, yes, closer together as you mount the stairs, and that the width of the passage narrows, as does the ceiling. It was the perfect place for a pope to stand, because he'd be dressed in white, backlit from a window. I mean, you really had to know what you wanted to see him about, because he really was remote and had other things on his mind. But Bernini also adds a landing halfway up the stairs. If you look way over at the right, you'll see that there is a corridor. You won't see there's a corridor. You will see there's a corridor, or you won't see there's a corridor. You'll see a corridor, but halfway up you'll see a landing place. And in a way, that makes the trek up the stairs even more tiring. I don't know how many of you go to the Angelica Theater down on Houston Street, but they have been promising an escalator for, 4 years. There are 31 steps, and there are landings in between. The landings make the journey quicker and more difficult. At any rate, these were both projects which could only have come from Michelangelo or from his work. They, in this case, are doing the opposite of what he did, which was to enlarge and bring the City Hall to you. In this case, both of these are trying to make it smaller and farther away. And from there on to St. Peter's. This is a wonderful, I've never seen this orange color. It took us some time to find it. I'm not sure how well it works, but at any rate, you're looking down on St. Peter's with the oval, I guess I call it a piazza, in front of the church. The church itself took 100 years to build, and this is a marvelous sequence of drawings, and it has to do with the piazza. The original drawing on the left was by Bramante, and the center drawing is by Michelangelo. And you can see he is building on Bramante, but you can see the amount of muscle that he's put into it. However, the Pope did not want a Greek cross. Michelangelo wanted one because it would show off his dome. But the liturgy and history dictated that to Moderna, there needed to be a Latin cross, which is a longer leg. So you can see that Moderna's design is on the left. And I think, if I'm looking correctly, at the lower right, you can see the stair that Bernini put in, the Scala Regia. Whoever drew this was fooled because he shows the stairway parallel instead of getting narrower as you go up. At any rate, with the Latin cross, Moderna succeeded in hiding the dome. So you have to back way up before you get to see the dome. I think Michelangelo by that point had passed. But you see that not only has the front of the church blocked it, but Moderna has added another story, a fake story on top. He was not the most popular guy around at the end of this. But it meant that Bernini, who was then hired to finish out the Piazza, had a difficult task, to say the least. And what he did was, one, he turned the Piazza, we'll call it an oval, essentially with the long side going perpendicular with the church. And that makes you feel that you've shortened the distance. He also, again, you see the arms widening slightly as you approach the church. And he also pulled the steps out. All of these efforts were to bring people closer to the piazza itself, closer in the piazza to the church and vice versa. Piranesi was back. Once again, you can see he thought that the arms to the church were perpendicular to the church. And of course they weren't. Piranesi, I shouldn't pick on him. I have never seen a drawing of either the Campidoglio or St. Peter's which shows the armature the way it was actually done. Mussolini. Mussolini, I don't know whether he was the Italian Robert Moses or Moses was the American Mussolini, but he wanted to get to work and tear down the slums and build a bigger, better Rome. In this drawing, you see that the artist has already gotten rid of the Campidoglio and Santa Maria in the background, and Mussolini has a strange way of gripping the pickaxe here. He's ready to chop things up and get it done. He found a project which was consistent with the relationship that he had with the Pope Pius XI. In 1870, when the Pope then, Pope IX, Pius IX, it's IX and then it's XI, had thrown in and agreed that he would join the Italian state. He was paid money for his lands, and from then on became a subspecies, a subset of the various pieces of the Italian Republic. But there was never a treaty signed. And in the 1920s, when Mussolini took power, he had wanted to find ways to keep the Pope from bad-mouthing him, to put it quite simply. The Pope was quite critical of the fascists, and so he sat with Pope Pius XI and actually penned what was called the Lateran Deal. It was one in which if the Pope was more gentle or quiet in his criticism of the fascists, Mussolini would give the Pope a country. They gave him the Vatican, and it was to be a separate country, 108 acres. It's remarkable. I went there the first time just to add it to my list of countries. It's only a couple of steps. At any rate, as part of the deal, if you look down from the church, this is taken probably in, I don't know, maybe in the beginning of the 20th century, you'll see two roads. It's called the Spina di Borgo, which means the Borgo means neighborhood. Spina means the plug in the neighborhood. Now, nobody knows who thought up the idea. I think it was Mussolini. I think if I'd just been given a country, I'd be happy enough and wouldn't be asking for more, but nobody knows. History is not very open about that. At any rate, he decided to tear out all of the centerpieces, the spina, and open up the church. Now, this is exactly the opposite of what Sita was arguing. He was suggesting that, as he had said many times, that the best way to have a church in any piazza was to have it discovered. As I was saying, it is the pathway. You are searching for your faith, and you find it when you get to the piazza. It's like, think of Saul on the road to Damascus, for example. Anyway, you can see St. Peter's peeking out behind this very narrow alley. The Spina itself, the two roads and the buildings in between, actually had a couple of very good buildings by noted Roman architects, and it had a lot of trash as well. It also had a small piazza. At any rate, he tore it down. And this is what we got. Now, I think it's too hard on my part, but I'll tell you what popped into my mind was Disney World. There's the tour bus, happy tourists. You can see the lamp posts are all miniature obelisks, and up ahead is St. Peter's, and it is completely open. Cars, traffic, people selling religious tokens, all, I think, Mussolini's work. Perhaps the most popular photograph in tourist guidebooks to Rome, St. Peter's and the Trevi Fountain, for instance, but this one is very popular. And it shows the two churches at the Piazza del Popolo. The one on the left, Santa Maria in Monte Santo, Saint Mary of the mountain. And the one on the right is called Santa Maria dei Miracoli, the Saint Mary of the Miracles. Now, the churches look as if they're identical, until you notice that the bell towers are different. I was so pleased when I first saw it. Again, it was like the Eskimos, making sure there was a difference, making sure that it wasn't identical. In fact, it is actually less identical than it seems, because the church on the left had a bigger lot. And so they decided that instead of a circular church, which is what you get on the right, you get a church that has a pill shape, oval shape. So if you walk down a Via Corso, you would see, although nobody does because of the altitude at which you have to look. At any rate, the two different bell towers were what gave me a lot of pleasure. I also think it is the perfect mix of Romans and tourists. The faithful have a chance to go to two different churches, down the aisle and up to God. And meantime, the tourist can hike down the Via Corso and start shopping. At any rate, the tourist is probably American, just to make everybody feel a little better. This is my favorite. This is the Piazza San Carlo in Turin. And if you look at it for a moment, you realize that these two churches could not be built in the United States. They are two buildings, one church, but what they have done deliberately is, after laying out the church, actually adding or subtracting pieces to it which make them different. And again, it is something like Italy itself. We are one country, but we have different dialects, we have different cuisine, we have different experiences, and here it shows. And you notice that only one of the churches has a bell tower. That's fine. Again, it isn't laziness, it isn't malice, it's simply the fact that it's perfectly appropriate to have one a bit different than the other. Onto the great Piazza. This is a painting by Bastiani. I have trouble with the name. And it was painted in 1487, about 30 years before the library was being built. It shows the Doge's palace, but it is fascinating to me how many Italian artists cannot draw buildings the way they actually are. And this is a good example. He shows the pink brick here, kind of orange colored, and it's only about 1 story high. And it is only 1/3 of the building, when in actuality, the Doge's palace is half brick and half arcade, 2 floors of arcade. The building itself, which is, of course, famous around the world, is a wonderful, it's a wonderful building, but it is also a building that is giving us instructions. And that is that you are supposed to look at it, enjoy it, but to keep on moving. The arcade is what you imagine congesting pricing might lead us to a trip up Third Avenue where you can click off the blocks. Or better yet, you can run a stick along a banister. It says the front door's not here, but it's coming up. There had been a number of fires. I am sure that each of the rooms had their own means of making heat, whether it was kerosene or simply wooden fireplaces. Anyway, the Doge's Palace had these fires, and in 1577 they had a particularly brutal one, so bad that the procurati, the senators, the people who ran the town, had to decide whether or not to tear down the Doge's Palace or to leave it and rebuild it. Now, Andrea Palladio, one of history's greatest architects, took that moment to submit his own plan for what should be done. And he was turned down. Venetians were tough dudes. They turned him down, and the reason he turned him down is he'd put a doorway in the center of the facade. And in fact, that short-circuited the trip that you were to take past the Doge's Palace and to the entryway itself. At any rate, the design was turned down, and they rebuilt the palace as well. On the other side of the street is the library. The city was given a library of books by a wealthy donor and decided to build a library to house them and to do at the same time get rid of the crappy stuff that was there before that we saw in Bassianti's painting. At any rate, this was done by Jacopo Sansofino. He's my hero for the Renaissance. He got the compliment later from Palladio, who thought it was the best building of the Renaissance. But what he did, they didn't have enough program. It would have been wrong to build a building that is the same size as the Doge's Palace. So he built one arcade at the lower floor and then faked it with windows at the second floor, which were similar, nearly identical with the double height arcade that's at the Doge's Palace, and added some statuary on the top to give the building a little more heft. So what we had was not symmetry, but balance. And appropriately, the library was less important than the Doge's Palace. Here is somebody walking along, many people walking along. You look ahead, you see the Torre Orologico, which is the clock tower, and it is giving you a guideway to continue on to the Piazza itself. You can walk into the arch below and find yourself quickly at the Rialto Bridge and the Campo, where most of the shopping is done. At any rate, the thing that lurks out, if you look, you can see the flagpoles for the three trees, and they're kind of blocked. And that's because you're looking at the sidewall of something called the Loggia. Sansofino added to the Loggia. The Loggia was supposed to be a kind of a caucus room where the procurati, the senators, could go and scheme and hang out. And it is looking directly across the way to what's called the Porta della Carta, which is the front door to the Doge's Palace. And I can bet you my bottom dollar that every once in a while the senators would crack the door to see what was going on the other side of the piazza. Who's coming to visit the old man? The doorway is a wonderful piece of work. Down on the right-hand side is a woman, and she's looking into the area beyond. You can see at the end of this the Scala, which I'll show you next. But at any rate, she is the woman who was one half of the two women who were contesting the baby, and Solomon had to decide, and decided he was going to cut the baby in half. And one woman screamed, "No, give it to the other woman," and Solomon instead gave it to her because she showed that she was the real mother if she wanted the baby to live rather than to continue to be its parent. At any rate, you get to the Scala Gigante. Now, it is hard to show you with these drawings or these photos the scale. But if you look up to the left and right of the archway at the top of the stairs, you can see a railing. And you can sort of suppose how tall a human being would be. But the Doge would come out, and he would stand between two gigantic statues, one of Neptune and one of Mars, god of war, and the god of the sea. It would be impressive for anybody who was hoping to deal with the Doge. The Doge in question was a guy named Andrea Gritti. He looks fierce enough. I was hoping he was 5'2" or 5'3" because he'd look even more powerful at the top of the stairs. It turns out he was a normal height, and he was actually a pretty good man. He was the person who had engineered much of the work that was going on in the Renaissance. From there, from your trip, and by the way, when you got to the Loggia, somebody, courtiers would say, you girare a destra qui, meaning before you enjoy the joys and pleasures of Venice, you got to meet the boss. At any rate, from there, ta-da, too much is not enough. Bannister Fletcher and Siegfried Gideon, both eminent architectural historians who've written gigantic tomes, wouldn't even show a picture of the basilica because they snorted that how could you have a Byzantine window and a Gothic window in the same building, for instance, and that it was just a lot of glop. I think it's, again, it is a marvelous edifice, and only the Venetians could have done it. All of their plunder was put on display here. But had you walked into the square before 1526, you would have seen the following, which is that you would see the outline of the piazza, and there's the cistern, but the old they call it procurator's apartments, actually came out to here. So the campanile was bare. It was freestanding, but it was lined up along, and the character of this was like a wide street rather than a piazza. And what Sansovino did was get the city to agree to tear down the apartments and move the entire mess 60 feet back. Now, it took 60 years to do this. In the meantime, part of the library, which you see down there below the campanile, fell down, one of the vaulted ceilings. They put Sansovino right into the pokey, and he stayed there for a couple of days until a rich patron bailed him out. But he went back to work. They then told him that he had to pay for this collapse of the vaults in the library by himself, so they took money out of his salary, and he had to handle the relocation of all the people and books and other pieces of stuff that were in the old procurati's apartments. At any rate, they moved it back. He died. The job was taken on by another architect named Scamozzi. He was fired. Eventually, over 66 years, I'm going to pause because I think the first phone call I've gotten in years. Sorry, folks. At any rate, Sansovino continued, moved it back. Before he moved it back, and this is one of my favorite paintings. This is a painting by Gentile Bellini, and it is a painting that was done before the campanile was freed up. When it was freed up, it was like a maypole. You could swing around it and into the piazza itself from the Piazzetta. But you can see, if you look to the right, that the campanile is there, but it's hidden by being masked by that white building at the right end of the right side of the painting. All of the people in the profession are the same height, which gave me. Can you imagine telling Italians that they all had to be the same height to be in a production? I don't know who would be laughing most. I think it would have been Fellini. At any rate, there they are. And of course, this is about 3 times wider than the piazza really looked. Again, Whether it was promotional, whether it was simply not understanding, whether it was not seeing, I don't know. But it is, on any account, a wonderful painting. This shows the difference between the two. The top drawing is what was there, and the bottom drawing is what Sansofino was able to accomplish. A very smart guy. He made these new apartments for the procurati. The procurati really are the senators, the local politicians, and enlisted them in the cost. But you can see, again, that it widened. By the way, the Piazza San Marco also gets wider as you get to the church. This might have been by accident because it goes back, it went back 1,000 years practically. These are two paintings by Canaletto, one in 1724 and another one 15 years later. And I think Canaletto was beginning to understand the actual geometry. He does a better job of bringing the campanile out and showing you the other end. I think he'd learned something, I'm guessing. There's nothing that attests to that fact. At the far end, you see San Gimignano, not Gimignano, but Gimignano. And it was a church also done by Sansofino. It was torn down when the Napoleon's Austrian troops arrived and turned into they were turning it into his quarters. Napoleon did come to Venice, but they hadn't finished work, so he stayed in the Doge's palace. The Doge, in the meantime, had turned in his red hat, his corno, and was no longer in power. I'm going to show you one last slide, which is the other end of the piazza. And at first you may say, well, it's the other end of the piazza, so what? But if you look more closely, like looking at the stairway, the Cordonata coming down the hill from the Campidoglio, you can see that this is the work of three different guys over a period of time, all acting in a collaborative sense to finish the piazza, because each of the three faces of the buildings are slightly different one from another. Your mind will get it even if you don't recognize it. Thank you very much.
A few questions?
Sure. Yeah.
Hi, Fiore Solecci. I've been interviewing southern farmers all my life, and I noticed that in the South.
Just a little notion. The piazza is often avoided by the farmers.
The what is avoided?
The piazza of the small towns, because the farmers I've interviewed see the piazza as a place of judgment. And the farmers prefer flat spaces to be functional, like threshing and things like that. But my question is not so much, to comment on, my work necessarily, of course, but do you see a difference in the social function? Because you made a wonderful, I'm really so amazed at your erudition and this wonderful kind of catalog of the way the piazza is imagined. But do you see with your deep knowledge of Italy differences, social differences between the uses of the piazza? Maybe as a result of some of the things you're seeing, or maybe
between them and whom? Between who and who?
The North and the South?
Let's say we're North and South, for example.
From the North, no, not really. The bigger differences were ones, for instance, where the Signoria, which is what they called the area at the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence, has no church. Several of the cities in Italy, bigger metropolitan areas, had a campo or a square or a piazza without the church. That might be a difference. The Papal States, which controlled land, and were one of the competitors really in Italy, along with the Republic of Venice and the rest of it, would more often be able to build a church in the piazza because they controlled the land. They levied taxes, they raised an army, and they controlled it. But I don't see I don't see many differences beyond that. I do see a big difference in the use of the word piazza now. I read just recently that you can call a parking lot, I don't know what it is, parcheggio della macchina, dell'auto, but a parking lot can now be called a piazza. So it's like Kleenex. The word has spread. To that extent, it can be many, many different things.
This is very enjoyable. Thank you very much. I guess the basic question is, do you have a favorite? What is the perfect piazza?
I find that when I'm in Rome, usually the first thing I do is go to the Campidoglio, cup of coffee, watch government come toward me. Yeah, I'd say the Campidoglio. Well, now I have to think. The Piazza Fontana. I never go to the Trevi Fountain.
Craig, I have a question regarding San Gimignano, and we understand it's not one of your favorite piazze. And I read in a book by an American art historian, her name is Medina Lasansky. She wrote this book called The Renaissance Perfected, in which she analyzes the way in which fascism completed or changed some of the historical places that we associate with the Renaissance or the Middle Ages, including the Piazza of San Gimignano, making it, in their intentions, more medieval or more Renaissance, but really intervening in a very massive way, changing it and making it what it is now. So I was wondering whether maybe the changes that were brought in at the time of Mussolini were the things that you find more offensive.
I don't know. I don't know much. I don't know how much he actually got done. Actually,
No, in that he did.
but he had said he wanted more housing. He had said he wanted to get rid of the slums. That's what you
No,
always
that's
say.
for Rome. But he had this idea that was broader, that was to make what was already there, historical, more medieval or more Renaissance, according to whatever idea of medieval and Renaissance they had in their mind at the time of fascism. No, for Rome it's a different story.
Well, I have to say I hadn't thought of this before, but I would say it takes money.
Yeah.
And is that the best place to put it would be the next question. But the piazzas as they were originally designed were very much for a purpose. And so the expenditures that went into them were indeed those that counted. Whereas if you're just putting rouge on a, you find it harder to get money to do it. Somebody's going to say, well, this is just, I don't know beyond that. And if we're talking about futurism, they had a lot of ideas. And the exhibit here is really quite, it's a really nice piece of work, I must say. But the futurists really were very anxious not to build because they'd be caught having to, there are several buildings that extend for, I don't know, half a mile. Where are you going to find a piece of land where you can put a half a mile long building? But it was an idea akin to really Corbusier to bring us to a new way to think about building in the 20th century.
Thank
you. I'm going to ask you your indulgence to show you 3 more slides. I was hoping I'd get a question about this, but I haven't. And that is, there is a question in the back, yes.
I missed Piazza Navona.
Yeah?
Why?
Why what?
Oh, why you didn't?
Why do I like it? Why didn't I show it?
No, why you didn't show us Piazza Navona?
Well, I've talked to 7 or 8 people who are Italian since I first started this little project. Every one of them asked me what I thought of their own piazza in their own town. So I've had to apologize left and right from the very beginning. What I wanted to talk to you about, 3 extra slides, is that the idea of piazzas was something that New York City began to embrace. Now, let me just show you the first slide. In 1916, the city passed a zoning ordinance which included what's called a sky exposure plane, like the Empire State Building. A building could go up, and then it had to step back and continue until it got to a size that was only 25% of the lot, and then you could go as tall as you wanted. And architects spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to do the perfect building that stepped back from the street. Unfortunately, critics like Ada Louise Huxtable, for one, started calling this wedding cake architecture, especially after the granite and limestone facades disappeared and glass was substituted, and the buildings themselves she called looked like a wedding cake. In 1958, Phyllis Lambert, who was the daughter of Samuel Bronfman and had been studying in Paris, learned that her father was about to commission a New York City architect to do the Seagram building, which is shown in this picture here. This is a very famous photograph by Ezra Stoller, and it shows the plaza, and it shows the building, and people don't recognize that Four Seasons Restaurant was actually done so that they would block the blank building walls of the next property on the street. But it was heralded as a really easy thing to copy. 3 years after it was built, we changed the zoning ordinance again to allow these kinds of plazas, piazzas. But we're a democracy. We say that we are all equal. So as soon as that piazza was built, and it had a fourth side, which was the Racquet Club by McKim, Eden White. It was glorious. You'd see all four walls were closing in. The Racquet Club was across the street. But as soon as this building was built, the guy next door wanted to build his own piazza. And it did. It took a considerable amount of negotiation with the builder to get him to put that little 6-story wing on it. But you can see that the piazza is beginning to leak. And that's because if you can do what you did on your piece of land, and I have the same zoning, I can do exactly the same thing on my land. It's a very different way of approaching the issue of a piazza, and it's why it's very difficult to do that here. I love throwing 3 more slides on the screen. Any more questions? Thank you all.